Have you ever stood in a hospital corridor, 48 hours out of surgery, and realized that the person you were waiting to hear from wasn't coming? Not delayed, not stuck in traffic, just not coming. That's where this starts. Not with anger, with a sandwich. My neighbor Elaine had driven me to St. Michael's the morning of the surgery. She's 71, drives a 2009 Civic with a crack across the dashboard, and she showed up at my door at 6:15 in the morning with a travel mug of coffee and a paper bag from Tim Hortons. Egg salad on whole wheat. She pressed it into my hands and said, "Eat before they take you in. You're no good to anyone on an empty stomach." I ate the sandwich in the pre-op waiting room. I remember that clearly because it's the last moment before everything got complicated. My name is Edmund. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company out of Barrie, Ontario. I have two daughters. The older one, my daughter Sylvie, lives 40 minutes away in Innisfil. The younger one, my daughter Claire, moved to Calgary 8 years ago for work and never really moved back, not even in the ways that matter. My wife Patricia passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There is no graceful way to say that. It happened fast, and then it was over, and I was 60 years old and standing in a house that still smelled like her shampoo, and I had absolutely no idea what to do next. What I did eventually was drink. Not all at once. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It was more like a slow leak, a glass of rye after dinner that became two, that became me waking up on the couch at 3 in the morning with the television still on and no memory of the last 3 hours. I told myself it was grief. I told myself everyone did this. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true, and because I was alone in that house, nobody was there to tell me otherwise. Sylvie knew. She didn't say it directly, that's not how she is. But she started calling more often, asking how I was eating, showing up on Sundays with containers of soup. Her husband Kevin would sit across from me at the kitchen table and talk about the Leafs or whatever construction project was happening downtown, and I could feel him watching me, taking stock, reporting back. Claire called on holidays. Her voice always sounded like she was already thinking about the next thing. The drinking got worse after I retired. That's the truth of it. When you have somewhere to be every morning, when people are depending on you to show up with your head clear, you manage it. You hold the edges in. But when the days stop having shape, when every morning looks the same as the one before it, that's when it stops being something you control and starts being something that controls you. I don't remember the fall clearly. I know I was in the kitchen. I know it was a Tuesday. I know I hit the corner of the counter on the way down, and I know I was on the floor for a while before I reached my phone. Because when I called 911, the dispatcher asked me what time I'd fallen, and I couldn't answer her. Sylvie met me at the emergency room. She sat beside the bed and held my hand, and when the doctor left, she looked at me with the expression I'd been dreading for 2 years. Not angry, not disgusted. Just tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who loves you and can't keep watching you disappear. "Dad," she said, "you need help. Real help, not promises." I was admitted for the hip surgery 3 days later. A hairline fracture, they said, which could have been much worse. While I was still in recovery, Sylvie and Kevin had found a residential treatment program in Collingwood. 30 days, covered partially under my benefits from the union, the rest manageable if I was willing to do it. I said yes because I couldn't say no, not to that face. The program in Collingwood was called Cedar Ridge. It sat back from the road behind a stand of spruce trees, and it smelled like wood smoke and institutional cleaning products. My room was small. The bed was narrower than I'd slept in since I was a teenager. I shared a bathroom with a man named, well, I called him my hallmate, who snored like a chainsaw and always left his shaving kit on the wrong shelf. The first 2 weeks were the hardest thing I have ever done. That's not an exaggeration. I've poured foundations in February in Barrie. I've worked 20-hour shifts getting a project back on schedule. I've sat in a hospital room and watched my wife stop breathing. And I am telling you, those first 2 weeks in Cedar Ridge were harder than all of it, because they stripped away the one thing I'd been using to make everything bearable, and then they sat me in a circle of plastic chairs and asked me to talk about why. I talked about Patricia, a lot. About the way the house felt different after she was gone. Heavier, somehow, and also strangely empty, like a coat that no longer had anyone inside it. I talked about retirement, and how I hadn't realized how much of my sense of self was tied to showing up somewhere and being needed. I talked about Sylvie's soup containers and how each one made me feel loved and ashamed at the same time. I didn't talk about Kevin much. That was something I was still working out. He was good to Sylvie. I want to be clear about that. He was attentive, steady, reliable in all the external ways. But there was something about the way he managed information, the way decisions seemed to pass through him before they got to me, that I couldn't quite name. Small things. When I'd asked Sylvie directly about visiting me at Cedar Ridge during the program, she'd said she'd check with Kevin first. When I'd called her cell and she hadn't answered, Kevin would call back within the hour. Not her. Him. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was just how some couples operated. I told myself a lot of things that again weren't quite true. The 30-day program extended to 45 at the counselor's recommendation. I agreed. I was starting to recognize the shape of what I'd been doing to myself, and I wasn't ready to go back to the empty house with that understanding only halfway built. 45 days. On the morning I was discharged, I sat in my room and folded my things back into the same duffel bag I'd arrived with. I'd called Sylvie 3 days earlier to let her know the date. She'd said she'd be there. She sounded distracted maybe. I didn't press. I waited in the lobby from 9 in the morning until 11:45. The woman at the front desk offered me a coffee. Then a second one. She had the careful practiced kindness of someone who'd seen this particular situation before. At noon, I stepped outside. It was late October. The kind of cold that's just starting to mean business. Not the deep cold of January, but the first real warning of it, coming off Georgian Bay in a wind that cuts right through whatever you're wearing. The parking lot was mostly empty. My breath made small clouds. I had my duffel bag and $73 in my wallet and the clothes on my back. I sat down on the bench beside the entrance and I looked at my phone. There was a text from Sylvie sent at 9:02. Sorry, Dad, something came up. Kevin says maybe take a cab? I'll explain later, Kevin says. I sat with that for a moment. Then I put my phone in my coat pocket. I was trying to decide whether to call a cab or go back inside and ask the front desk for the number of a local taxi service. This is not a part of Ontario where rideshares are reliable, when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Edmund Bryce? I turned around. He was maybe 35, tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a good coat, the kind that says someone is doing all right for themselves without announcing it. He had a look on his face I couldn't immediately read, like he was trying to figure out how to say something he'd been rehearsing for a while. That's me, I said. He sat down on the bench. Not across from me, beside me, like we were old friends waiting for the same bus. My name is Daniel, he said. Daniel Ford. You probably don't remember me. I looked at him. The name didn't land anywhere. I grew up on Pemberton Street, he said. In Barrie. The gray house, across the lane from the Kowalski lot. And then something shifted. The gray house. There had been a family there. A single mother. 3 kids. The oldest a quiet, watchful boy who used to sit on the back step reading paperbacks, while his younger siblings ran around the yard. Gail Ford's boy, I said. He nodded. I hadn't seen him since he was maybe 12 or 13. His mother had moved the family to Sudbury after she remarried, and that was that. The way it goes with neighbors. I saw your name in the Cedar Ridge intake registry, he said. I'm on the board of directors. Volunteer position. I grew up around addiction. I wanted to give something back. He paused. I almost didn't come. I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do. Why did you? I asked. He looked out at the parking lot. Because of what you did for my mother in 2009. I thought back. 2009. Patricia was still alive. I was still working. What had I done for Gail Ford in 2009? He told me. There had been a leak in their basement. Gail had still been renting the gray house by then. She hadn't left for Sudbury yet, and the landlord had been ignoring it for months. The water had been getting into the electrical. Daniel had been in his early 20s, working a labor job, sending half his paycheck home. He'd come to me because he'd seen me with tools and didn't know who else to ask. I had gone over with my kit on a Saturday morning and I'd fixed the leak. It had taken most of the day. I hadn't charged them anything. I'd barely thought about it afterward. You told my mother. That's just what neighbors do, he said. I didn't remember saying that. It sounded like something I might say. She talked about it for years, he said. It wasn't just the leak, Mr. Bryce. We were in a rough stretch. My mom was holding it together by her fingernails. That day mattered to her in ways you probably can't imagine. He looked at his hands. She passed 2 years ago. But she talked about it for years. We sat in the cold for a moment. I'll drive you home, he said. I told him I couldn't ask him to do that. He said he wasn't asking for permission. On the drive back to Barrie, He had a clean, sensible SUV, something Japanese. I didn't look at the badge. He told me about his life. After Sudbury, he'd gone to university in Ottawa, law school in Toronto, articled with a firm in Barrie, and had been practicing as a solicitor for 7 years. Family law and estates, mostly. He'd come back to Barrie deliberately, he said. He wanted to practice where he was from. I told him about Patricia, about Cedar Ridge, about the fall. I told him haltingly about Kevin, the way information moved through him, the way Sylvie's calls came later, after, the way she'd started to seem smaller, somehow, in the years since the wedding, less like herself. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer quick reassurances. He just listened, and I could feel the quality of his attention. Not polite attention, but professional attention, the kind that's organized and remembers things. When he pulled into my driveway, he said, "Do you have someone looking after your financial and legal affairs?" I said I had a will from 2018. He asked if I had a power of attorney. I said Patricia and I had done a mutual one years ago. "Who's your attorney now?" he asked. I thought about it. "I suppose it would revert to Sylvie." He nodded slowly. "And Kevin, as her spouse, would have significant influence over how she exercises that." I hadn't put it together that plainly before, but when he said it, it settled somewhere in my chest with the quiet weight of something that had been true for a while and just hadn't been named. "I'm not saying anything has happened," Daniel said carefully. "But given what you've described, and given that you've been away for 6 weeks, it might be worth sitting down and reviewing your accounts." He came inside. I made tea because it was something to do with my hands. We sat at the kitchen table and I got out my papers. Mortgage documents, bank statements, the folder Patricia had labeled "Tinforton open if necessary" in her careful school teacher handwriting. The checking account looked right. The savings account looked right. But the investment account, the RRIF that was supposed to carry me through retirement, that I'd been contributing to since 1991, had had a redemption process 6 weeks earlier, $31,000. I sat there and stared at the number. "Was that you?" Daniel asked. I shook my head. My hands were very still. I've noticed that about myself. When something truly bad is happening, I go still. I don't shake. I just stop moving, like my body is trying not to disturb whatever is in front of it. Daniel took out his phone. "Is your online banking set up?" We found it together. The redemption request had been submitted online. The account had a secondary authorized user, Sylvie, added 4 years ago during the worst of the drinking, when I'd thought it made sense to have someone who could act if I couldn't. The request had originated from a device I didn't recognize. The funds had been transferred to an account I'd never seen before. "I called Sylvie," Kevin answered. "She's not available right now," he said. "Can I take a message?" I told him I needed to speak with my daughter. I kept my voice level. I was very focused on keeping my voice level. "She's resting," he said. "She's been under a lot of stress. This probably isn't the best time." "Kevin," I said, "put my daughter on the phone." There was a pause. Then Sylvie's voice, careful and flattened in the way it had been getting lately, like something turned down low. "Dad, you're home." "I am," I said. "I'd like you to come over. Now, please. Both of you." Another pause. "Kevin thinks it would be better to Sylvie." I said her name the way I used to say it when she was small and something was genuinely wrong. Not angry. Just, direct, present. "Come home." She came. Kevin drove. They sat on one side of the kitchen table, and Daniel sat on the other, beside me. Kevin looked at Daniel the way men look at obstacles they're deciding how to move.
"Who are you?"
he asked. "Daniel Ford," Daniel said pleasantly. "I'm a solicitor. I'm here in a personal capacity as a friend of Mr. Bryce." He set a printed page on the table. "This is a summary of the transaction I'm describing. I'd encourage you to look at it before you say anything else." What followed was not the explosive confrontation you might expect. Kevin was too careful for that. He started with explanations. It was a loan. It was temporary. Edmund had discussed it with him in a phone call during the program. He said this calmly, like a man who had rehearsed it. Sylvie said nothing. She was looking at the printed page. Daniel said, also calmly, that there was no record of any such conversation in the Cedar Ridge call log, that phone calls during the program were monitored and documented, and that the timing of the online transaction corresponded to a day I had not made any outgoing calls at all. Kevin shifted. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding." "There may have," Daniel agreed. "That's exactly why I'd suggest returning the funds within 72 hours, at which point we can discuss whether there's anything further that needs to happen." He paused. The alternative is that I file a report with the OPP on Mr. Bryce's behalf Monday morning. That's not a threat, it's information. Sylvie made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Kevin said he needed to think about it. Daniel said, of course. They left. Sylvie stopped at the door and turned back to look at me. She looked, I don't know how to describe it exactly, like someone waking up in a room they don't recognize. Frightened, but also like something was starting to come back to her. Something she'd set down and forgotten about. Dad, she said. I know, I said. I didn't know about the money, I swear to you I didn't know. I believed her. That was the complicated part. I believed her completely, and I also understood that not knowing was its own kind of problem. That she had given this man so much management of her life, that things had happened under her name that she hadn't known about. Come for dinner Sunday, I said. Just you. We can talk. She nodded. She was crying a little. She left. Daniel stayed and had another cup of tea. The money came back within 48 hours. All of it. No explanation, no note. Just a transfer back and then silence from Kevin. The following week, Sylvie came for dinner alone. She brought her mother's recipe for butter chicken, handwritten on an index card she'd found in a box she'd been going through. We sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked for 4 hours. It was the longest real conversation we'd had in years. She told me things. Some of them I'd suspected. Some of them I hadn't. I'm not going to repeat them here because they're hers, not mine. What I will say is that by the time she left that night, she had the name of a family lawyer and a counselor, referrals from Daniel, and she had told me she was going to make some changes. I didn't push. I've learned not to push. You can't fix a person from the outside. You can only make sure the door is open. We talk every few days now, on the phone mostly. Sometimes she sounds like herself again. That girl I used to drive to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning, wrapped in a sleeping bag in the back seat, both of us barely awake, the roads iced over and the sky still dark. She'd always fall back asleep on the way home, hair still damp from the shower, and I'd carry her inside. I still know how to do that. How to carry her, I mean. Just differently now. I haven't seen Kevin since that evening at the kitchen table. I don't know what's going to happen there, and I've made my peace with not knowing. That's not my story to finish. Daniel and I have lunch every month or so at a place near his office downtown. He refuses to let me pay, which drives me crazy, and I've stopped arguing about it because he's a lawyer and he will win. He's doing my new power of attorney. A trusted friend, someone outside the family, a former colleague from my working years, a man I've known for 25. Daniel walked me through why that was the cleaner choice, legally and personally. I signed it last month. It felt like putting on a seatbelt after a long time driving without one. The house smells less like absence now. I don't know when that happened exactly. Maybe when I started cooking real meals again. Maybe when Elaine started coming over on Thursday evenings and we started watching that British baking show she likes. Maybe when I stopped trying to fill the quiet and just started letting it be quiet. I'm not fixed. I want to be clear about that. Recovery isn't a door you walk through and then you're on the other side. It's something you do every day, in small ways, in the choices about how you're going to meet the morning. I go to a meeting on Tuesday nights in a church basement on Dunlop Street. There are 12 of us. I've stopped counting how many days it's been because my counselor said that for some people the counting becomes its own kind of grip, and I think she's right. What I count instead is dinners. Dinners with my daughter, lunches with Daniel, Thursday evenings with Elaine and the baking show. There's a particular kind of person who counts on you staying broken, who built their arrangements, emotional, financial, otherwise, on the assumption that you wouldn't recover, wouldn't get clear, wouldn't one day sit down and look at your own accounts and understand what you were seeing. Kevin counted on that. And the man who showed up in the Cedar Ridge parking lot on a cold October morning, he wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't a miracle. He was just a neighbor's son who remembered a Saturday in 2009 and decided, when he had the chance, to do what neighbors do. I've thought about that a lot, about the smallness of the original act. An afternoon with a pipe wrench and a tube of sealant. A problem that took me maybe 4 hours to fix and cost me nothing but a Saturday. And what it came back as, 15 years later. You never know what you're building when you're being decent to someone. You're not building toward anything. That's not why you do it. You do it because it's the right thing in that moment, and you go home, and you forget about it. But sometimes, when you need it most, it remembers you.